Honestly, Amelia, don't be selfish. We decided Clara needs that 25,000 far more than you do right now. My mother, Eleanor, didn't even set down her wine glass as she casually reallocated my entire future. The crystal goblet caught the warm golden light of the expensive chandelier above us, casting a fractured rainbow across the pristine white linen tablecloth. We were seated in the center of Le Jardin, the city's most ostentatious steakhouse, the air thick with the scent of truffle oil and old money. We were here to celebrate Clara, as usual. I froze. The silver fork in my hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy, anchoring me to a reality I didn't want to believe. Excuse me? My voice was barely a whisper, swallowed instantly by the ambient chatter of the wealthy patrons dining around us. I looked from my mother to my father, heart hammering against my ribs. That $25,000, Mom, that's the money Grandma left us specifically for me in her will. It's in a separate account. My PhD tuition deposit is due in 3 weeks. My father, Richard, cleared his throat. A deep, rumbling sound that always signaled an end to any negotiation before it even began. He adjusted his silk tie, his gaze fixed intently on the medium-rare filet mignon in front of him, refusing to meet my eyes. "Now, Amelia, let's not make a scene," he said, slicing into his steak with surgical precision. "We have to look at the bigger picture. We're talking about family strategy here. Grandma wanted her money to help her granddaughters succeed. Your mother and I are simply interpreting how best to apply that aid where it will yield the highest return." Clara sat preening across from me, glowing in a new designer dress that probably cost more than my rent for the next 3 months. She took a sip of her wine, her eyes bright with triumph, and reached out to pat my father's hand affectionately. "Daddy's right, Amy. You have to be realistic," Clara said, her voice dripping with a condescension she tried to pass off as sisterly advice. "Think about it. You've always been the practical one. You're good at figuring things out. You have your little tutoring jobs, and you know how to budget. You know how to scrape by." She smiled then, a tight, practiced curve of her lips that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. My vision for Clara's couture online? It's delicate. It needs significant capital to generate buzz, to get the right influencers. It needs a real launch pad. You can't expect me to start from the bottom, Amelia. I wasn't built for the bottom. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold in the heated room. "Scrape by," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. I had worked 3 jobs simultaneously through my master's degree, graduating at the top of my class, solely counting on Grandma's legacy for this final academic hurdle. Clara had barely managed a C average in a general communications degree, her entire life funded by our parents' credit cards, and now she wanted to play business owner. "It's an investment, Amelia," my mother interjected sharply, signaling the waiter for another bottle of Pinot Noir, dismissing my distress as easily as she would a fly. "Clara has vision. She has a spark that needs fanning. You have always been perfectly capable of managing on your own. You're strong like that." She made it sound like an insult, not a compliment. "Consider it your contribution to your sister's success. Frankly, we expected you to be happy that we found a good use for the money, rather than just handing it over to some university." I looked from one face to another. My mother's dismissive arrogance, my father's cowardly avoidance, Clara's smug entitlement. There was no apology in their posture, no hesitation in their voices. They hadn't just decided to steal my grandmother's final gift to me. They felt morally superior for doing it. A waiter appeared, pouring ruby-red wine into my mother's glass, oblivious to the theft happening right in front of him. I sat there, surrounded by luxury, feeling an unparalleled poverty of spirit. I didn't say another word. I couldn't. The lump in my throat was too large, chalking back a scream of injustice. I realized then that I wasn't a daughter at this table. I was just a resource to be harvested so Clara could continue to shine. The silence that settled over me wasn't peace. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of absolute betrayal. I didn't take a cab. The thought of making polite, meaningless conversation with a stranger was unbearable. Instead, I took the number 14 bus, the one that rattled and groaned its way across town towards the neighborhood where people like me lived. I pressed my forehead against the cold, vibrating glass, watching the brilliant lights of the downtown restaurants bleed and smear into long, watery streaks through the rain-slicked window. Each golden blur was a world I didn't belong to, a party I was never truly invited to. My mother's words echoed in the rhythmic hiss of the bus's air brakes. Clara needs it more. It wasn't the theft that hollowed me out, it was the justification. The casual, almost righteous certainty that my needs, my dreams, my grandmother's dying wish were secondary. And as the bus rumbled on, the fresh, sharp agony of the dinner began to recede, replaced by the dull, familiar ache of a much older wound. My mind, seeking context for this latest betrayal, began flipping through its own sad, well-worn file of evidence. It wasn't a single act of cruelty, it was a pattern woven into the very fabric of my life. The first memory to surface was my 16th birthday. We'd had a small family dinner, much like tonight, only at home. My father had presented Clara with a small, beautifully wrapped box. Inside was her first designer handbag, a buttery leather Michael Kors satchel that she'd squealed over for a solid 10 minutes. My gift was a book. Its title was The Efficient Teen's Guide to Time Management. I remember staring at the cartoon of a teenager juggling books, a soccer ball, and a clock, feeling a profound sense of confusion. Later, when I found my mother in the kitchen, I'd asked her why. She'd patted my cheek, her touch light and dismissive. "Amelia, darling, you're the smart one. You need practical tools for your future." "Clara," she'd sighed, a wistful, dreamy look in her eyes. "Clara was born to shine. She needs beautiful things to match her spirit." The bus lurched to a stop, pulling me from the memory. A young couple got on, laughing and shaking the rain from their hair, their easy affection a stark contrast to the coldness seeping into my bones. The doors closed and my mind drifted again, this time to a hotter, sunnier day. My high school graduation. I was the valedictorian. I had spent 4 years sacrificing my social life, staying up until 2 a.m. studying, driven by a desperate need to make them proud. I remember standing on the stage, the podium light hot on my face, delivering my speech about the future. I saw them in the 3rd row. They clapped, of course, a polite, perfunctory sound. But as soon as the main ceremony was over, they were gone. I found them 20 minutes later at the small auxiliary stage in the gymnasium, where Clara was receiving an honorable mention for her spirited dance performance in the school's talent show. The only family photograph taken that day was of the 3 of them, beaming with Clara holding her flimsy photocopied certificate as if it were a Nobel Prize. My valedictorian medal, heavy and gold in its velvet box, remained in my pocket, unseen. When I later asked my father why they had rushed off, he just looked flustered and said, "We couldn't miss your sister's moment, Amelia. You have to support family." A wave of nausea washed over me, and it had nothing to do with the rocking motion of the bus. The pattern was so clear, so painfully obvious. My accomplishments were duties performed. Clara's trivialities were events to be celebrated. The final memory was the most recent, the one that should have warned me about tonight. Last Thanksgiving. The house was filled with my father's business associates, the kind of people he was desperate to impress. While Clara, resplendent in a new burgundy dress, drifted through the living room, charming everyone with practiced anecdotes about her university life, I was in the kitchen. For 5 straight hours, I'd helped prep the turkey, mashed the potatoes, washed every dish, refilled every wineglass. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, my hands raw and chapped from the hot water, listening to the waves of laughter from the other room. At one point, I heard Mr. Abernathy, my father's senior partner, ask who had made the incredible pumpkin pie. My mother's voice, clear and proud, had rung out, "Oh, it's an old family recipe. Clara has such a delicate touch in the kitchen, doesn't she?" The bus finally hissed to a stop at my corner. I stepped out into the damp, chilly air, the city's grime feeling more honest than the sterile elegance of the restaurant. As I walked the final block to my small rented apartment, the tears that had threatened all night finally fell, but they were not hot with grief. They were cold with the chilling finality of understanding. It was never about my worth. It was about my function. I was the responsible one, so I could be burdened. I was the practical one, so I could be deprived. I was the strong one, so I could be broken. Tonight wasn't a betrayal. It was simply the system, operating as designed. And the quiet ache in my chest was no longer sadness. It was the slow, hardening pressure of a resolve I never knew I had. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that felt fundamentally different. The betrayal from the night before hadn't broken me. Instead, it had burned away the fog of hope and obligation that had clouded my vision for years. In its place was a stark, cold clarity. I was alone, and that meant I was finally free to rely solely on myself. My world shrank to the size of my tiny, book-cluttered apartment and the triangle of locations that defined my existence. My life became a meticulously scheduled regimen, a testament to the time management book they'd given me all those years ago. The mornings began at 5 a.m. with the jarring scream of my alarm. By 5:45, I was behind the counter at The Daily Grind, a noisy coffee shop 3 blocks away. The air was a constant assault of hissing steam wands, the aggressive whir of the bean grinder, and the endless loop of cheerful indie pop music. For 4 hours, I wasn't Amelia Harrison, graduate student. I was just Amelia, a smiling automaton in a stained apron, forcing my voice into a chipper tone as I took orders for lattes with oat milk and an extra shot. I learned to ignore the stinging ache in my feet and the sticky residue of spilled syrup on my hands. Every $5 bill dropped into my tip jar was a small victory, another brick in the wall I was building around my independence. At 10:30, I would rush back to my apartment, wash the smell of coffee from my hair, and transform. By noon, I was in a lecture hall on campus, the hard plastic of the chair a familiar discomfort. This was my sanctuary. Here, the noise of the world fell away, replaced by the intricate beauty of data models and economic theory. I always sat in the front row, my pen flying across the pages of my notebook. While other students scrolled through their phones, I absorbed every word, asking the questions no one else dared to. This was the one place where my effort was the only currency that mattered, where the name Harrison meant nothing. I wasn't just studying for a degree, I was forging armor. My afternoons were a frantic race against time in the university library, surrounded by the quiet rustle of turning pages and the comforting scent of old books. I devoured texts, completed assignments, and pushed myself deeper into my field, fueled by lukewarm coffee from my thermos. Then, at 6 p.m., my third life began. Seated at my wobbly desk, the glow of my laptop screen casting a pale blue light on my face, I became an online math tutor. For 3 hours, I would patiently guide teenagers through the labyrinth of quadratic equations and geometric proofs. "No, remember, you have to carry the one," I'd say, my voice a calm, steady drone, even as my own brain felt frayed and exhausted. It was grueling, repetitive work, but it paid the rent. Dinner was almost always the same: a block of instant ramen noodles boiled in a small pot, sometimes with a single egg cracked into the broth, a luxury I allowed myself twice a week. While the water boiled, I would sit with my small, worn ledger. I wasn't just budgeting, I was waging a war. Every dollar was a soldier, assigned a critical mission. $4.50 for a loaf of bread, $12 for the coin-operated laundry, $2.75 for a bus pass. There was no room for error, no space for impulse. When friends from my program texted, inviting me out for a drink or a movie, my reply was always a variation of the same lie. "Thanks so much for the invite. I'm swamped with a huge project. Rain check." I'd watch the 3 dots of their reply pop up and disappear. The sting of my self-imposed isolation, a necessary sacrifice. Late at night, when the final tutoring session was over and the silence of my apartment pressed in, I would pull out the only photograph I kept on my desk. It was a faded picture of my grandmother, taken years ago at a county fair. She was smiling, her eyes crinkling at the corners, a testament to a life of hard work and quiet dignity. It was her money they had stolen, but it was her spirit they could never touch. Looking at her face, I would make a silent promise. "I won't let them win," I'd whisper into the quiet room. "I will not let your faith in me be for nothing. I will build my own legacy." The pain was still there, a hot ember in my chest, but now it served a purpose. It was the fire in my forge. It was a Tuesday afternoon, midway through the bleakest, most exhausting semester of my life, when the email arrived. The sender was Dr. Alistair Hansen, the department head, and a man who was more of a legend than a professor. He taught the most advanced course on quantitative analysis, a class so notoriously difficult that half the students dropped it within the first month. The email was brief, almost curt. "Amelia, please see me in my office at your earliest convenience to discuss your midterm paper." My blood ran cold. My mind immediately leaped to the worst conclusion. I had made a critical error, misunderstood the entire premise, and he was calling me in to suggest I drop the course before I failed it completely. I spent the next hour in a state of quiet panic, my hands trembling as I walked down the hushed, hallowed halls of the faculty wing. Dr. Hansen's office was nothing like the modern, sterile spaces of the other professors. It was a cavern of knowledge. Books overflowed from shelves that reached the high ceiling. They were stacked in precarious towers on the floor, and they spilled across his large oak desk. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and something faintly like cherry pipe tobacco. He sat in a worn leather armchair, a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, my paper held in his hands. He was a man in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of a lifetime of critical thought. "Miss Harrison, thank you for coming," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. He motioned for me to sit in the chair opposite his desk. I've just finished reading your analysis of the St. Petersburg paradox. I swallowed, my throat dry. Is there a problem, doctor? He looked up at me over the rim of his glasses, a long searching look that made me feel utterly transparent. A problem? He repeated slowly. He set the paper down on his desk, tapping a finger on the cover page. The only problem, young lady, is that I have to figure out what grade to give this that isn't an insult to the work itself. I've been teaching this subject for 42 years. I've read thousands of papers on this topic. None of them, he paused, leaning forward slightly, have ever seen it from this angle. I just stared at him, my mind refusing to process his words. You didn't just restate the theory, he continued, a new energy in his voice. You didn't just solve the equation, you dismantled the entire premise of the question. You examined the flawed human psychology behind it. Amelia, he said my name as if it were a discovery. You have a rare analytical mind. You don't just solve problems, you see the very essence of them. And that's when it happened. A single hot tear escaped my eye and slid down my cheek. I tried to discreetly wipe it away, mortified, but it was followed by another and then another. It wasn't a sob, but a silent, uncontrollable cascade. A release of pressure I didn't even know I'd been holding. All those nights fueled by cheap ramen, all the hours spent in the library until my eyes burned, all the sacrifices and the silent screams of injustice. It all came pouring out in those quiet, salty tears. For the first time, someone had looked past the tired girl in the worn-out sweater and had seen my mind. And they had called it valuable. Dr. Hansen didn't seem embarrassed or flustered. He simply pushed a box of tissues across the desk and waited patiently. It would seem, he said gently, that this comes as a surprise to you. I finally found my voice, choked and thick with emotion. No one has ever said anything like that to me before. He nodded, a knowing, almost sad look in his wise eyes. Well, they should have. Talent like yours should be cultivated. He folded his hands on the desk. I am the lead on a new research project, funded by the Atherton Foundation. We're developing a predictive model for macroeconomic shifts in emerging markets. It's complex, data-heavy work. I need a research assistant, someone who can see the patterns others miss. He let the offer hang in the air. The position comes with a generous stipend. It would more than cover your tuition and living expenses. The work would, I believe, be the foundation of a very promising doctoral thesis. I sat there, speechless, the tissue clutched in my hand. He wasn't just offering me praise, he was offering me a lifeline, a way out, a path forward that I could earn, that no one could take away from me. It was more than a job. It was a lighthouse, cutting through the densest fog I had ever known, showing me that there was, in fact, a shore. Accepting Dr. Hansen's offer was the first real choice I ever made for myself, and it became the cornerstone of everything that followed. The research project was a crucible that forged my academic skills into practical, marketable expertise. When I graduated with my PhD, 4 years after that fateful meeting in his office, Dr. Hansen didn't just shake my hand, he made a phone call. That call landed me an internship at TechCorp, a top-tier data analytics firm that normally only recruited from the Ivy League. The TechCorp office was a different universe. Gone were the rattling bus rides and the lingering smell of stale coffee. Here the air was cool and filtered, humming with the quiet power of 100 high-end servers. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling glass walls, reflecting off gleaming chrome and polished concrete. It was a world built on logic, data, and results. a language I had secretly been mastering my entire life. My internship wasn't a guarantee of a future. It was a 3-month audition. I was assigned to a project everyone else considered a dead end, analyzing years of customer feedback data that had been written off as unquantifiable noise. While other interns were assigned to glamorous, high-profile accounts, I was given the digital equivalent of the dusty attic. So I went to work. I was the first one in the office every morning, my keyboard clicking away, while the sky outside was still a hazy pre-dawn gray. I was the last one to leave, long after the catered dinner had been cleared away. I spent weeks developing a natural language processing model from scratch, teaching myself advanced coding languages through online tutorials late into the night. 2 months in, I found it, a subtle, recurring pattern of complaints that, when correlated with shipping logs, predicted a major supply chain failure with 98% accuracy. My report landed on the CEO's desk. 2 days later, my project manager called me into his office and offered me a full-time contract as a junior analyst with a salary that made my head spin. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage, holding the offer letter, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. I didn't cry this time. I felt a deep, profound calm wash over me. The first thing I did with my first real paycheck was transfer the exact amount of my remaining student loans into a separate account, and then I paid them all off in one single glorious transaction. The second thing I did was open a high-yield investment account. I set up an automatic transfer and began to rebuild. I watched my balance climb, meticulously tracking it, until one day, about a year later, it passed the $25,000 mark. It wasn't my grandmother's money, but it was mine. Earned, not given. Reclaimed, not inherited. The promotions came steadily after that, from junior analyst to analyst, after I streamlined the company's entire inventory forecasting system. Then to senior analyst, when my risk assessment algorithm saved the company from a disastrous partnership. My practical mind, the one my mother had so casually dismissed, was now a celebrated asset. I learned to speak in meetings, my voice quiet but firm, my arguments backed by irrefutable data. I no longer flinched when challenged. I simply pulled up another chart. Now, 4 years after starting as an intern, my business card reads, Amelia Harrison, Director of Data Analytics. My title, my office with its glass wall overlooking the city, my 6-figure salary, my diversified investment portfolio. These were the weapons I had forged in silence. My independence was my shield, my expertise was my sword, and my confidence, once a flickering ember, now burned with a steady, quiet heat. I rarely thought of my family. They existed in a distant, parallel life. But some evenings, when a project was done and my mind was quiet, a detached curiosity would lead me to Clara's Instagram. It was no longer a source of pain, but a case study in failure. I analyzed it like I would any other dataset. There were photos of her in Santorini, but I recognized the dress from a post made 2 years prior in the Hamptons. A shot of her sipping champagne in Milan was geotagged to a local Italian-themed restaurant. The Gucci bags were always the same 2 models. The website link in her bio was now dead. The comments were mostly from bot accounts. The performance was growing tired. The audience had left, but she was still playing to an empty theater. I would close the app, not with anger or even pity, but with a cold, clear finality. Clara had been given a launch pad built with stolen money. She had used it not to build a rocket, but to stage a photo shoot that never took off. I, on the other hand, had been given nothing but rubble, so I had learned to build my own wings. and now I could fly anywhere I wanted. The quarterly review meeting was at its critical juncture. I stood at the head of a polished mahogany table, a laser pointer in my hand, gesturing towards a complex projection of market trend data on the screen behind me. The room was silent, save for the sound of my voice and the quiet respect of the 7 vice presidents listening to my analysis. In this room, my opinion mattered. My work had value. I felt a familiar surge of calm, controlled confidence. This was my world, a world I had built with logic and effort. Then my phone, set to silent on the table beside my laptop, began to vibrate violently. A single frantic buzz, then another and another. I glanced down. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in over a year. Mother. A rule, unspoken but absolute at this level, was that you never let the outside world breach the walls of a meeting like this. It was a sign of disrespect, of being distracted. I felt a hot flash of annoyance, followed by a cold, familiar dread. This could not be good. "Excuse me for one moment," I said, my voice perfectly even. "I need to take this." The VPs nodded, their faces impassive. I stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway, the heavy, soundproofed door clicking shut behind me. I took a deep breath before answering. "Hello, Amelia, finally." My mother's voice was a frantic, high-pitched shriek, laced with an accusation that it had taken me 3 rings to answer. "It's your father. There's been an incident." I leaned against the cool glass wall, my professional calm beginning to fracture. "What kind of incident? Is he okay?" "He had a stroke. A minor one, the doctors are calling it. But you know how these things are. They want to do a procedure, an angioplasty, something with his arteries. The point is, Amelia, the insurance won't cover all of it. There's a deductible, co-pays, and they're saying this specific surgeon is out of network. It's going to be an astronomical amount of money." She was rambling, her words tumbling over each other in a torrent of panic and self-pity. I waited for the inevitable, the hesitant, shameful request for a loan, but it never came. Instead, her tone shifted, the panic hardening into an edict. "You need to handle this, Amelia," she commanded. "You're the only one with a stable career, with a real salary. It's your responsibility to take care of this. We need the money wired to the hospital by the end of the week." I felt nothing. Not sadness, not fear, not even pity. The years of pain had been replaced by a layer of scar tissue so thick it was numb. The only thing I felt was a profound, chilling clarity. "Responsibility," I repeated, my voice as flat and cold as the glass at my back. "That's an interesting word." A beat of confused silence on the other end. "What is that supposed to mean?" she snapped. "I was just thinking about another financial matter," I continued, my tone conversational, almost detached. "Whatever happened to the $25,000 Grandma left me? And how is Clara's couture doing? I assume the fashion empire is generating enough income to cover a family emergency like this." The line went completely quiet. I could hear her sharp, panicked intake of breath. That has nothing to do with this," she finally stammered, her voice losing all its bluster. "That was an investment, Clara. She ran into some issues. It was a business risk, Amelia. Something you wouldn't understand. The money is gone." "So the company never existed," I stated. It wasn't a question. "Don't be ridiculous," she sputtered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "It existed, as a concept. She tried. It was just more difficult than she anticipated." I almost laughed. $250,000 in family money, a $25,000 inheritance stolen from me, all for a concept. Sensing she had lost all ground, my mother played her final, predictable card, emotional blackmail. Her voice began to tremble with manufactured tears. "How can you be so selfish?" she sobbed. "We're talking about your father's life. He's lying in a hospital bed, and you're bringing up old, petty grievances about money. I raised you to be a better daughter than this." And that was it. The final brittle thread of obligation snapped. This wasn't a desperate plea from a terrified wife. It was the same old story, the same shameless demand for a sacrifice I was expected to make without question. They had squandered their resources, wasted their opportunities, and now they were coming to harvest the fruits of my labor. I was not their daughter. I was their emergency fund. A strange calm settled over me. The anger was no longer hot. It was a block of ice in my chest. "I see," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Let me review my finances. I will be in touch." Before she could reply, I ended the call. I stood in the silent hallway for a long moment, my reflection staring back at me from the gleaming glass wall. A woman in a tailored suit, a director in a powerful corporation. They had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. They thought they were calling the broken girl they had left behind. They were about to meet the woman she had become. I chose the restaurant myself. It wasn't the Chancellor, with its gilded ceilings and hushed reverence. It wasn't anywhere they would ever choose to be seen. It was a place called the Corner Bistro, a clean, well-lit diner with laminated menus, checkered floors, and the faint, lingering scent of bleach. It was neutral territory, a place where their name and their money meant nothing, a place where they would have no power. I arrived at 7 p.m. on the dot. They were already there, crammed into a booth by the window, looking wildly out of place. My mother, Eleanor, was wearing a silk blouse that was too formal for the setting, her face a mask of strained patience. Clara sat beside her, sullenly scrolling through her phone. A 5-year-old designer handbag placed on the table like a territorial flag. They both looked up as I approached, and I saw a flicker of something in their eyes, shock, and perhaps, for the first time, a sliver of fear. I was not the Amelia they remembered. The girl in the faded sweaters and practical shoes was gone. In her place stood a woman in a sharply tailored navy blue pantsuit. My hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. My low, practical heels clicked with quiet authority on the linoleum floor. I carried a simple leather portfolio, nothing more. Their discomfort was a palpable thing in the air between us. My mother's practiced smile faltered for a second. Clara's eyes did a quick, resentful scan of my outfit, a silent, bitter appraisal of its quality. I saw the question in her expression. "How can you afford this?" I didn't sit down. Instead, I stood at the end of their table, my portfolio held loosely in one hand, and I simply looked at them. I let the silence stretch, letting it become as uncomfortable for them as 1,000 silences had been for me. My gaze wasn't angry or accusatory. It was analytical. I was a scientist observing a specimen. My mother was a study in barely contained desperation. The fine lines of stress around her eyes were deeper than I remembered. The corners of her mouth pulled down in a permanent state of dissatisfaction. Clara was a faded photograph of her former glory. The entitled confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, petulant shell. They were waiting for me, the family ATM, the practical one, who always figured things out, to dispense the solution to their latest self-inflicted problem. And in that long, weighted silence, a thought crystallized in my mind with perfect diamond-hard clarity. 5 years ago, in a restaurant 10 times as grand as this, I was the unwanted guest at their celebration, an awkward footnote in the story of Clara's brilliant future. Tonight, in this humble diner, they were the supporting cast in my carefully staged play, a play I had been writing unknowingly for years. There was no rage left inside me, only a quiet, unassailable certainty. The scales had finally, irrevocably, tipped. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 30 seconds, I moved. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the seat my father would have taken, and sat down. The sound of the chair legs scraping against the floor was loud in the quiet restaurant. I placed my portfolio on the table, my movements deliberate and unhurried. I folded my hands on top of it and met their anxious gazes. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice calm, even, and utterly devoid of the warmth they had always taken for granted. "Let's begin." A young waitress with a nervous smile appeared, her notepad poised. "Can I get you folks something to drink to start?" Her eyes darted between the three of us, sensing the iceberg of tension floating just beneath the surface. "I'll have a coffee black," my mother said, her voice tight and clipped, as if the very act of ordering from such a place was a personal indignity. Clara just mumbled, "Coke," her attention still glued to the screen of her phone. "Just water for me, thank you," I said, offering the waitress a small, reassuring smile. She scurried away, and the moment she was gone, my mother seized the opening. She attempted to rearrange her features into a mask of maternal pride, a performance I had seen 1,000 times. She placed her hands on the table, palms up, a gesture meant to seem open and sincere. "Amelia, just look at you," she began, her voice a syrupy confection of false warmth. "So polished. That suit is just lovely, so professional. I always knew you had a wonderfully practical head for numbers and your little spreadsheets. It must be such a relief," she continued, leaning in as if sharing a secret, "knowing that everything has come to you so logically, so easily." The words were a masterclass in passive aggression, a perfectly crafted insult disguised as a compliment, easily, as if my success was the inevitable result of a simple equation, a foregone conclusion that required no real struggle, no sleepless nights, no sacrifice. She was erasing my entire journey in a single sentence, reducing my life's work to a quaint hobby, thereby establishing their right to its profits. I met her gaze, my expression a placid, unreadable lake. "Easy?" I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air between us like a puff of smoke. "Tell me, Mother, what part of the last 5 years looked easy to you?" She blinked, the practiced smile faltering. "Well, I just mean you've always been so capable." "Let me be more specific," I said, my voice remaining level, each word a carefully placed stone. "Was it the part where I would scrub dried milk from a steam wand at dawn? The smell of burnt coffee clinging to my hair all day? Was it the part where I would sit in the library until it closed, my eyes burning from the fluorescent lights, because I couldn't afford all the required textbooks? Or was it the weeks when I lived on nothing but instant ramen and slept an average of 4 hours a night, so I could pay my rent and tuition after you decided my grandmother's legacy was better spent on a concept?" I leaned forward slightly, my hands still folded calmly on top of my portfolio. "Which of your memories of my life, Mother, includes you being there for any of it? You don't know what it was like, because in all that time, you never once called to ask." Clara finally looked up from her phone, her face a mask of indignation. "Oh, here we go," she sneered. "Here comes the martyr. You always have to make everything about you, don't you, Amelia? We're talking about Dad's health, and you're bringing up ancient history. It's so pathetic. Before I could respond, my mother's phone began to ring, a shrill classical ringtone that was jarring in the quiet diner. She glanced at the screen, a flicker of what looked like relief crossing her face. "It's your father," she announced, as if the cavalry had just arrived. She fumbled with the phone and pressed the speaker button, placing it in the middle of the table like a holy relic. "Richard, darling, you're on with the girls." His voice, tinny and thin, through the small speaker, filled the booth. "Amelia, are you there?" "I'm here," I said. "Good." There was a pause, a rasp of breath. "Listen, your mother told me about your hesitation. I'm disappointed. You can't be this way, Amelia. A family is a unit. It's an enterprise of mutual support. We invested in you for 18 years. We fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head. We gave you the Harrison name. There is an expectation of reciprocity. Now a crisis has come, and it's your time to perform your duty. That is how a family operates." It was a pre-rehearsed speech, a pathetic appeal to a set of rules they had never once applied to me. They hadn't invested in me. They had met the bare minimum legal requirement of parenthood before casting me aside. A sound escaped my lips then. It wasn't a word, but a short, sharp exhalation of air. A laugh utterly devoid of humor or joy. It was the sound of a 5-year-old dam of resentment, meticulously constructed, finally cracking under the pressure. My mother and Clara stared at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and horror. "Duty?" I asked the phone, my voice dripping with an irony so cold it could have frozen the water in my glass. "You want to talk to me about duty and family investment, Father?" I looked from the phone to my sister, whose face had gone pale. "Are you talking about the kind of duty that honors a grandmother's dying wish? Or the kind of family investment that takes a daughter's inheritance, money specifically earmarked for her education, and hands it over to her sister to fund a fantasy life of European vacations and designer handbags?" I leaned back in the booth, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a vast, empty calm. The truth was finally out, laid bare on the sticky tabletop of a cheap diner. The phone on the table was silent. My mother stared at me, her mouth slightly agape, the fake smile gone, her face a canvas of pure, undisguised shock. Clara looked as if she'd been slapped. They had walked into a negotiation armed with their worn-out weapons of guilt and obligation. They had not expected me to arrive with an arsenal of facts. The silence that followed my question was absolute. It was heavier than any argument, more damning than any confession. Even the tinny speaker on the phone was quiet. My father, for the first time in his life, had nothing to say. My mother's face was a mess of conflicting emotions, shock warring with indignation, guilt with rage. Clara just stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the condescending smirk finally wiped clean from her face. The waitress returned, placing our drinks on the table with a tentative hand. A black coffee, a Coke, and a glass of water. Mundane objects in the middle of a demolition. I ignored my water. My movements were slow, deliberate, as I reached for the leather portfolio in front of me. The quiet snap of the latch opening was the only sound in our booth. It felt as loud as a gunshot. "You speak of duty and investment," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "Let's review my portfolio, shall we? A different kind of investment." I reached inside and pulled out the first item, a heavy cream-colored cardstock, protected in a clear vinyl sleeve. I slid it across the table. It was my doctoral diploma. A PhD in economic analysis, I stated, my voice clinical. Summa cum laude, achieved with a 4.0 grade point average, 3 published papers, and without a single dollar of financial support from either of you. My mother glanced at it, but her eyes didn't seem to comprehend the words. It was just a piece of paper to her. "That's very nice, dear," she started, the automatic, dismissive praise a reflex. "I'm not finished," I said, cutting her off. I reached back into the portfolio. The second item was smaller, a crisp white business card. I flicked it onto the table, where it landed squarely in front of Clara. She looked down. I watched her eyes trace the embossed lettering. I saw the exact moment she read the words, her brow furrowing in confusion, then her eyes widening in disbelief. "Amelia Harrison," I recited from memory. "Director of Data Analytics, Tech Corp." Clara's head snapped up, her eyes locking with mine. Tech Corp. Everyone knew the name. It was one of the biggest, most innovative data firms in the country, a fortress of success and ambition. And I wasn't just working there, I was a director. The word hung in the air between us, an impassable chasm, separating her failed concept from my concrete reality. The girl she thought was scraping by was in a position of power she couldn't even comprehend. "And finally," I said, reaching into the portfolio one last time, I pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a quarterly statement from my investment firm. I didn't unfold it completely. I simply turned it over and pointed to the single, circled number at the bottom of the page. "This is my net liquid worth. As you can see, it is substantially more than the $25,000 you took from me." "That money," I said, my gaze sweeping over both of them. "The money my grandmother left me, the money I needed, I made it back myself, and then I made more." I folded my hands back on top of the now empty portfolio. My case was presented. The evidence was on the table. I looked at my mother, at the utter collapse of her composure. I looked at Clara, at the envy and resentment warring in her eyes. And I thought of my father, listening silently on the phone, his world of patriarchal authority having just been dismantled by the daughter he never valued. "So yes," I said, my voice dropping, each word precise and final. "I have the money to pay for Father's hospital bills. I can wire the full amount tonight and not even notice it's gone." I let that sink in. Then I stood up, my chair making a soft scraping sound. "But the question was never whether I can." I looked them straight in the eye one last time. "The question is, after everything you've done, why should I?" My final question hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the booth. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the tinny, forgotten sound of my father's breathing through the phone's speaker. My mother's face, which had been a mask of shock, finally crumbled. It was a complete and total disintegration. The carefully constructed facade of the society wife, the proud matriarch of the Harrison name, fell away to reveal the raw, ugly desperation beneath. She lunged forward, not with anger, but with the frantic energy of a drowning woman. Her hand shot across the table, her manicured fingers grazing the sleeve of my jacket. "Amelia, please," she whispered, her voice cracking, all pretense of command gone. "Please don't do this. He's your father. Whatever you think of us, whatever mistakes were made, you can't abandon him now. We're family." Her eyes were wide, swimming in tears that were, for the first time, horrifyingly genuine. I looked down at her hand on my arm, the skin of her knuckles pulled taut with tension. I felt the slight tremor in her fingers. Then I looked back up at her tear-streaked face. In that moment, I expected to feel a surge of triumph, a rush of satisfaction at her unraveling, but there was nothing. There was only a vast, quiet emptiness, a hollowed-out space where my love and need for her used to reside. I didn't pull my arm away. I simply stood there, a statue of cool indifference, letting her feel the complete and utter absence of any emotional response from me. I turned my head slightly, my gaze sweeping over her and then landing on Clara, who was staring at her hands in her lap, finally and completely silenced. I spoke, my voice hardening, each word a chip of ice, carved from a glacier of old pain. My grandmother worked in a textile factory for 40 years, I said, my voice low but carrying across the small table. She used to come home with her fingers raw and swollen from pulling thread, the lint permanently embedded in the lines of her skin. But she never complained. She had a saying she repeated my whole life, a lesson she learned from watching the looms weave thread into cloth, day after relentless day. You reap what you sow, she'd say. You can't plant weeds and expect to harvest roses. I let the words settle, let the image of that hard-working, honorable woman fill the space between us. I wonder what she would think if she could see you now, all of you. My eyes met my mother's. You planted lies and cruelty. You sowed disrespect and deceit. My gaze shifted to Clara. You reaped the benefits without ever touching the soil. And now, in your time of need, you come to my field and expect to harvest forgiveness and aid. The accounts simply don't balance. My mother's hand fell away from my arm as if she'd been burned. I will not let my father die, I stated, my voice leaving no room for argument. The sentence was a fact, not an offer. I am not you, but my help will not be a gift. It will not be an act of familial duty, because this family, as you have defined it, is a bankrupt institution. I picked up my leather portfolio from the table, my finality a physical act. My assistance will come with conditions, strict, legally binding conditions that will change the structure of your lives. You will not like them. They will not be easy. But if you want my help, you will accept them without negotiation. I looked from my mother's terrified face to Clara's stunned one. I will have my lawyer draft a proposal. He will contact you in exactly 3 days with my decision and my terms. I suggest you use that time to reflect. Think long and hard about what you have done. Think about the harvest you are now facing. And with that, I turned. I didn't look back. I walked away, my footsteps echoing with a quiet, steady rhythm on the checkered linoleum floor. I left them there, frozen in their booth in the cheap diner. A crumbling mother, a dethroned princess, and a silent, helpless patriarch on a speakerphone, left alone with the bitter taste of a justice they had never believed would come. 3 days later, they were summoned to the offices of Davies and Finch, a law firm located on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper. The room was a study in quiet, expensive power. A large mahogany table polished to a mirror sheen, high-backed leather chairs, and a panoramic view of the city I had fought so hard to conquer. My mother and Clara sat on one side of the table, looking small and utterly out of place. They had come expecting to receive a check, perhaps after enduring a final sanctimonious lecture from me. They were not prepared for Mr. Davies. My lawyer, a sharp, silver-haired man in his 60s with an air of implacable calm, sat at the head of the table. I sat to his right, a silent observer. I had already given my instructions. My role now was simply to watch. Mr. Davies adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and looked at the 2 women opposite him with an expression of polite neutrality that was far more intimidating than any anger could be. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice calm and professional. "Ms. Harrison has authorized me to present her offer of assistance regarding the medical expenses for Mr. Richard Harrison. This assistance is contingent upon your acceptance of all terms outlined in this legally binding contract." He slid 2 copies of a thick, spiral-bound document across the polished surface of the table. My mother flinched as if it were a snake. Clara stared at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. "A contract?" my mother asked, her voice thin and reedy. "I don't understand. Amelia said she would help." "And she is," Mr. Davis said smoothly, his tone unwavering. "However, her help is designed to be corrective. Let me summarize the key provisions for you." He picked up his own copy, his movements precise. "First, Miss Harrison will pay the full outstanding balance of Mr. Harrison's medical bills directly to the hospital. This payment will be structured as a formal interest-bearing loan to you, Eleanor and Richard Harrison. A standard repayment schedule will be attached." My mother's face went slack with shock. "A loan?" Mr. Davies continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Second, to secure and repay this loan, the property at 12 Gable Ridge Lane, their large, mortgaged-to-the-hilt family home, is to be listed for sale within 30 days. The proceeds will first satisfy the loan to Ms. Harrison, with any remainder to be used to purchase a smaller, more financially appropriate residence, such as a condominium or a townhouse." A choked gasp escaped my mother's lips. The house was her entire identity, the grand stage for her performance of a perfect life. To lose it was to lose everything she valued. "Third," Mr. Davies said, his gaze shifting to my sister, who now looked physically ill. "Clara Harrison will be required to secure full-time, verifiable employment within 60 days. From her monthly net income, 25% is to be automatically donated to a new scholarship fund established at the local community college. The fund will be named the Evelyn Harrison Memorial Scholarship for Women in Trades, in honor of your grandmother." Clara looked as if she had been physically struck. Forced to work a real job, and then forced to give away her earnings in the name of the grandmother whose legacy she had so casually helped squander. It was a poetic, perfect consequence. "Fourth, Richard and Eleanor Harrison will be required to enroll in and complete a certified course on personal financial management. Proof of completion will be required." And finally, Mr. Davies said, looking at both of them over the rim of his glasses, "The entire family unit, including Richard once he is able, will attend mandatory monthly family therapy sessions with a court-approved psychologist. Ms. Harrison will cover the cost of the first 6 sessions. Continued financial support of any kind, including any potential leniency on the loan, is contingent upon documented attendance and good faith participation." He set the paper down. "You may, of course, refuse these terms, in which case Ms. Harrison's offer of assistance is immediately and permanently withdrawn." Silence. It was the sound of their world collapsing. They had walked in expecting a handout, a simple transaction that would allow them to continue their lives uninterrupted. Instead, they had been handed a curriculum. This wasn't a rescue, it was a court-ordered rehabilitation. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed not through the single grimy window of a cramped apartment, but through the large, clean panes of a bay window overlooking a garden I had planted myself. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, a simple luxury I now savored, mingled with the fragrance of blooming lavender from the flower beds outside. My home was quiet, peaceful, filled with books that weren't just for studying and furniture that wasn't sourced from a thrift store. It was a sanctuary I had built, not just with money, but with peace of mind. Hanging on the back of my bedroom door was my wedding dress. It was simple, elegant, and timeless. My fiancé, Michael, a kind and brilliant architect, who loved me for my mind before he ever knew about my career, walked in, handing me a steaming mug. He kissed my forehead, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Ready for the big day?" he asked, his eyes full of a genuine admiration I had once thought was a fiction. "More than ready," I smiled. Later that afternoon, as I stood in the bridal suite of the small historic inn where we were to be married, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Dr. Hansen. He had retired from the university a year ago, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He looked distinguished in his tailored suit, his white hair neatly combed, his eyes twinkling. He was holding a small velvet box. "I am not your father, Amelia," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that caught me by surprise. "But I have watched you grow with more pride than any father could have. It would be my life's greatest honor if you would allow me to walk you down the aisle." Tears welled in my eyes, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. He was the one who had seen me, the one who had given me a chance when no one else would. He was the father of my spirit, if not my blood. I took his arm, my heart overflowing with gratitude for this chosen family, the one I had built for myself. As we stood at the back of the sun-dappled garden where the ceremony was taking place, I saw them, my family. They had signed the contract, of course. They'd had no choice. They sat in the very last row of chairs, almost hidden behind a large oak tree. They were shadows at the edge of my new, bright life. My mother wore a simple, off-the-rack dress, the kind she would have sneered at 5 years ago. My father, thinner and grayer since his recovery, looked straight ahead, his expression unreadable but subdued. And Clara looked ordinary. Her hair was a simple, unstyled cut. She wore no flashy jewelry. She had a job, I knew, as an administrative assistant at a dental office. I had seen the reports from the scholarship fund in my grandmother's name, her 25% contribution arriving like clockwork every month. They were not here as honored guests. They were here as witnesses. Their presence was the final silent clause of the contract, to see firsthand the life they had tried to prevent, the happiness they had no part in creating. There was a strange new posture to them, not of humility exactly, but of a quiet, grudging respect. The kind of respect one gives to a force of nature they no longer have any power to control. Dr. Hansen squeezed my arm gently. "Don't look back, my dear," he whispered. "Your future is that way." And I turned my gaze forward to where Michael was waiting for me under an arch of white roses. I took my first step down the aisle, not as a victim, but as a victor, walking into a life of my own design. Later that evening, after the last of our wedding guests had departed and a quiet peace had settled over the house, I found myself standing by the large window in our living room. Michael was in the kitchen making us tea. Outside, the moon cast a silvery glow over the garden, illuminating the lavender bushes I had planted near the stone path. It was my garden. Every flower, every stone, was a choice I had made, a root I had put down in soil that belonged to me. I rested my hand on the cool glass, my new wedding band a comfortable, solid weight on my finger. My mind drifted back, not with the sharp pain of old wounds, but with the detached clarity of a historian reviewing a closed chapter. I thought of the $25,000 that had once felt like the beginning and end of my world. They had taken the money, yes, but in doing so they had given me a gift far more valuable. They had given me a fire. They had forced me to discover a strength I never knew I possessed, the strength to build a life from nothing but grit and sheer force of will. They had robbed me of an inheritance, but they had given me the power to build my own legacy, a legacy not of bloodline, but of backbone, a legacy not measured in dollars, but in dignity. It was founded on the resilience they tried to break, the self-respect they refused to give, and finally, the ability to forgive. And that was the final piece of the puzzle: forgiveness. I had come to understand that it wasn't a gift I was giving them. It wasn't about forgetting the cruelty or excusing the injustice. Forgiveness was for me. It was the act of putting down a heavy bag I had been carrying for far too long, a bag filled with their betrayals, their expectations, and their failures. It was the final quiet act of setting myself free. My phone, resting on the windowsill, buzzed softly, pulling me from my thoughts. I picked it up. It was a text from a number I didn't have saved, but I knew who it was. It was from Clara. There was a photo attached, a group of people, including her, smiling and holding muddy shovels, in front of a newly planted community garden in a run-down part of the city. She looked different. Tired, but with a genuine light in her eyes I had never seen before. Below the photo, there was a short message. It said, "We finished the playground today. The kids love it." I know I'll probably never be able to say it in person, but thank you, Amelia, for everything. I stared at the message for a long time. It wasn't an apology for the past. It was an acknowledgement of the present. It was the first honest thing she had ever said to me. The thank you wasn't for the money or for saving our father. It was for the harsh, painful lesson. It was for the contract that had forced her, for the first time in her life, to build something real. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Michael came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. "Everything okay?" he whispered. "Yes," I said, leaning back into his warmth, my gaze returning to the moonlit garden outside. "Everything is perfect." I had my answer now. The true values, the ones my grandmother had lived by, the ones I had fought for, had not just survived. They had won. And in the quiet peace of my new life, I knew with absolute certainty that they always would.